So, this is June 22nd, 2018.
Recording or just talking?
Recording.
So I better not interrupt.
If you interrupt, it won't be the end of the world. We'll just pick up where we left off.
If you find me totally gone,
Yeah?
it probably means I took her up the mountain for a walk.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Lovely.
It's a great area to let a dog run off leash, just 5 minutes uphill from here.
In Liberty, we bring Billy up Walnut Mountain, and it's like a glorified hill, but still, it makes all the difference.
Yeah, ours is called Mountain Meadow.
Mountain Meadow.
It's a nature preserve.
Beautiful. All right, so it's June 22nd, 2018, the day after the summer solstice, so the amount of daylight is getting shorter and shorter as we head into darkness. This is Stephen Palmer talking with Howard Cruse in his home in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and this is for the Stonewall Oral History Project. Howard, why don't you take 10 minutes or so and talk about where you were brought up, family, religion, brothers, sisters, and then we'll steer that off into sexual identity and as we unfold to the issue at hand, and then with Stonewall, and then after we'll get into the comics in a really big way. Okay?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I was born in Birmingham, but my father decided to change careers and become a minister, and he got licensed to be a Methodist minister, whatever the term is. And so he was assigned to a church, a Methodist church in Springville, which is a small farm town, at the time about 30 minutes outside of Birmingham. I mean, these days there's more interstates, and so it's not that far. And but he got in a fight with the congregation of his church, actually with the deacons, and we wound up changing to Baptist. So that was the 1 year that he was a full-time minister. After that, he was a lay minister, lay Baptist minister, and he worked in various sort of journalistic and photography fields, and commuted to Birmingham for a good bit of work. And I spent the first, we moved to Springville when I was 4.5, and then until I lived in Springville until I was roughly 13, which is when my parents sent me to a progressive boarding school called Indian Springs, which was south of Birmingham in the direction of Montgomery. And it was a very special school. They wanted to free me from the Alabama public school system as practiced in Springville, which was, there were some good teachers here and there, but, in general, there was not a lot of support for intellectual curiosity. Basically, any student who suggested that he enjoyed school was considered a teacher's pet or a brown noser or something. And it was entirely different at Indian Springs, where creativity of any sort was encouraged, and you actually got peer support if you decided to do a project that wasn't assigned. And I was recognized for my interest in cartooning and got a lot of encouragement for that, and worked for and then edited the school newspaper, the student newspaper, and was elected to the student government, which was in a form of a city type of thing. There was a mayor and various commissioners covering different aspects of student life. And unlike the student councils in many schools, the student government at Indian Springs was actively involved with the faculty in developing policy. And anyway, it was all about learning to self-govern, learning to self-discipline, being as excellent as you could intellectually, just everything a high school should be. Anyway, so that was how I got out of the sphere of Springville.
Could I interrupt for 1 second?
Sure.
You know, it's interesting. Indian Springs had this kind of Summer Hill feel at that time in the Deep South.
It was inspired by Summerhill.
How did that happen there? I mean, I don't want to sound prejudiced against the South, but it's just early on, and it's...
Well, it was all about a particular rich guy, Harvey Woodward, who, in his will, left a bunch of money. Actually, he wanted to establish a whole lot of schools throughout the South that would be progressive, and he unfortunately his wife challenged the will and got a lot more money than he had put in the will she should get. So he wound up the money would only cover one school, but that was about 30 miles south of Birmingham, and they had both day students and boarding students. I was a boarding student. The day students took a bus in every day and left in late afternoon. But living at Indian Springs full time was great for my development because I was no longer the preacher's kid. I could forge my own identity, and so I blossomed in a lot of ways at Indian Springs. I think if I'd had to stay in Springville, I probably would have been severely depressed by the time I reached my senior year in high school. It was just not a place to go to school.
What was it? What do you think was depressing about it for you? I guess the question I'm asking is, did it have anything to do with sexual identity at that point?
No, of course. I had no idea what sexual identity was most of that time.
Or whatever the term may have been at the time.
When I say negative things about the Springville education, I have to say that I had several really good teachers, particularly in elementary school. My first grade teacher was a wonder. She was a little person. She was basically maybe 2 or 3 inches taller than the average first grader. And she was, obviously, to look at her, you saw she was a middle-aged woman, but she wasn't scary like other adults. And we had a lot of fun. It was I was encouraged. She saw that I liked to draw. She encouraged me in a lot of ways. And that was a good starting point. And I had other teachers who were really good. It was only when we started hitting high school, you started getting a lot of mediocre teachers. And if I'd gone long enough, I might have had some other favorite teachers there. But essentially, the culture of the school was not encouraging for intellectual pursuits.
Mm-hmm.
And Springville was a great place to be, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And there were lots of woods to play in, a lot of freedom to run around the neighborhood. All the people knew each other. They knew whose kids were whose. For most of that time, we had a single operator who operated the phone system at a switchboard. And so if a parent didn't know where a kid was, you'd call her up, you'd buzz her up and say, do you have any idea where Howard might be? And she would call around town and say, who's seen Howard Cruse? And
wow.
So anyway, it was a really nice place to be a kid in. But when I began reaching, a sexual awakening, and also just the kind of little modes of rebellion that come with approaching teenage years and being a teenager, it felt oppressive to not have any privacy. And so...
What year were you in high school? What period are we talking about now?
Well, at high school, or...
Yeah.
I started at Indian Springs in the fall of 1958.
Okay. How old were you at that point?
I guess that would be 14.
Okay, so you were born about 44 or so?
Yes, 44.
Okay.
And so anyway, that when I went to Indian Springs was when I felt free to question the religion I'd been brought up in.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I give my parents credit for was that they knew that Indian Springs was a place where you were encouraged to not necessarily automatically accept, received wisdom from adults, and they knew that religion might well be questioned. And my brother had gone there. I have a brother, Alan, who was 3 years older than me, and he went there first, and he just loved it, and that's when I began to be enthusiastic about going. Are you going to squeak at me all afternoon, Punky? Sorry. Punky, you want to go back out? Unfortunately, I'm hooked up. I can't let you out. So you may get a lot of dog squeaking.
Do you want me to let her out?
If you can unhook yourself easily and
Yeah,
open that screen door again.
Let me pause. Let's continue.
Okay. So my brother was 3 years older than me. He went to Indian Springs first. And, when he left, I thought, it would be awful to live away from home. But he loved it so much, and we visited him out there, and I saw what a nice school it was. So by the time I was able to go, I was enthusiastic about it. And so then, as I say, once I escaped the hovering population of Springville and could just be Howard and not the preacher's kid Howard. And I was beginning to feel oppressed by the lack of privacy in a small town. And I was beginning to we had this, things looking back on it, I realized, my gayness was entering the picture, but I didn't recognize it for what it was. I wrote a comic book story, which is that book, called Jerry Mack, which is based on a real incident in Springville when an important member of the church congregation, who was very active, he suddenly was gone. And nobody would talk about why he was no longer in church or in town. But then finally, after I pressed my parents, they explained that the father of a teenager became convinced that this guy had come on to his teenage son. And so he had asked the church preacher, the full-time preacher, to go with him to their home, and he beat up this guy who may or may not have been guilty of coming on to his son, but who chances are he did, but who knows. We weren't there. But this father thought he was queer and deserved to be beaten up and told to get out of town immediately. So that's was explained his disappearance. And that also was my introduction to the idea that terms like queer actually applied to real life human beings. It was just an abstract term, like cocksucker, Kids would call each other cocksuckers, and it didn't occur to me that anybody would ever actually, suck a penis. And I had no inclination to do so myself at that time. But I did sort of wonder, as I became aware of the world of fine art, why it was so common to paint naked women, but I wasn't seeing paintings of naked men. And then I was in a secondhand magazine store in Birmingham. My parents would let me go into Birmingham by myself when I was hitting 11 or so, and I took the bus into town. and I had this favorite place where I would go to buy, look for old issues of Mad Magazine. And in rummaging around there, I came upon an early gay porn magazine called Body Beautiful, which pretended to be a magazine for artists who wanted to do figure drawings of men but couldn't afford an actual model. So it had lots of pictures of almost naked men, except you had to wear a posing pouch at the time. You couldn't have completely expose your genitals legally.
A posing pouch.
Oh, you're actually not aware of the term a posing pouch. It's like a jock strap, except instead of straps going around, there's basically just elastic string. So essentially, the only thing that's covered are your genitals. And so it was legal. And so the magazine was just sort of didn't acknowledge that it was a gay magazine, but that's obviously what it was. And then from ads in the back of that, I discovered the existence of other gay porn magazines. There was a magazine called Body Beautiful, which was posed as, for bodybuilders, and lots of photographs of similarly naked men, virtually naked men. And I finally got up the nerve to subscribe to that. We didn't have home delivery of mail. You had to go to the post office and pick it up. The post office was on the way back when I would walk home from school. So I always made sure I got to the post office box before my parents did. Of course, everything was also mailed in a plain brown envelope in those days. Nothing to say that there was anything sexual in it. But that was my introduction to eroticism of gay males. And I, when I finally learned to masturbate, I did a lot of masturbating to those pictures. I did some horseplay with a friend who was a year older than me. We played it, I'll tie you up, you tie me up, see if you can get loose. That's how it started. But then it started getting, so now we'll do it with less and less clothes on. And eventually we were tying each other up naked. And it was incredible to have access to another male body, innocently, just because I had to touch things to move ropes around and stuff. So that was my introduction to actual sexual behavior, but I didn't know what sexual behavior was then. I just knew that I really enjoyed that.
The tying up is, it's a pretty hot story there.
Yeah, well, rope became permanently fetishized for me from those
I can imagine.
introduction. But anyway, then I went away to Indian Springs, which was an all-boys school at the time, and it was nobody was comfortable about gayness. I mean, all-boys schools had a reputation, were a suspect, so all the guys were quite clear about how straight they were. But there were some vendors of porn in Birmingham that would look the other way about age limits. So some of the guys would come back to the school with heterosexual porn magazines, and they would be passed around, and everyone would find that very titillating. But this was actually, it was around then that Playboy started, but it took a while to become aware that a porn magazine could be classy and intellectual. Most of these, they had sleazy-looking women in them, and the only attraction was that people were naked, and and they would have short stories in them, illustrated short stories with women and being assaulted and stuff like that. Always with the genitals hidden. But then one of the students at Indian Springs actually was nervy enough to subscribe to Playboy, which meant that it would come through the school mailboxes. And but the school is kind of committed to freedom in a lot of ways, and they did not challenge him. His Playboys would be delivered, and he would share them with friends. And it was in Playboy. They had a feature that showed, sort of the daily life of Allen Ginsberg, and it was frank about the fact that he was homosexual. By then, I'd started thinking, I wonder if I'm homosexual.
What year is this about now?
Well,
Playboy
I went to there when went in '58, so I was there between fall of '58 and spring of '62.
Mm-hmm.
And Ginsberg, the first time I had ever seen a man who dared to let his hair grow to his shoulders, and who said he was homosexual, and who was not banned from polite society for that. He was one of a handful of cultural figures who were my role models and made me feel that it might not be the end of the world for people to know that I was homosexual, if I turned out to be homosexual. But of course, all the literature at the time said that all boys go through a homosexual phase, but then they become heterosexual. So I went through all my whole high school years waiting for that to happen and doing whatever I could to encourage sexual feelings about women. But I was pretty, I could avoid suspicion because it was an all-boys school. A lot of the boys, when they had dances, the day students, they had old friends in Birmingham, girlfriends, and they would bring them out to school for dances and stuff. And but I was not under pressure. I wasn't a day student, so nobody thought it weird that I wouldn't have girlfriends at hand. My sophomore roommate got a little worried about my social development, and he leaned on me to double date with him a couple of times. The first time was we went to a movie. We went to a drive-in movie, and a girl and I that I'd never met before, we were in the back seat, and he and his girlfriend were in the front seat, and they started necking heavily. And I sort of felt like I was supposed to be necking heavily, but I totally was not feeling it. It felt totally awkward. So so it was kind of, the whole thing was awkward. And then when he tried to get me to double date again, I said I did not want to go anywhere where you could really seriously neck. And so they went to an in-house movie theater, and I managed to get myself to put my arm around the girl, but it was totally not motivated by any kind of desire. I felt I was doing what was socially expected. And after that, I said refused to date again. I never dated again for the entire high school years. I had a crisis my senior year in high school when it began to be apparent that I was not growing out of my gay feelings. And although at the time I just thought I was depressed and alienated in some general way, and I attempted suicide. And but I survived because I was an incompetent suicider. And but anyway, it was enough of an incident that when my parents knew and the head of the school knew and everything, that they insisted I go into therapy in Birmingham. There was a counselor, a therapist. Unfortunately, he was homophobic. When I told him I thought I might be homosexual, he said, "No, you're not. You just been going to an all-boys school. You need to date girls. So when you go to a college that's co-ed, and be sure and date girls." So that was his answer to that. So I did go to Birmingham Southern College, mainly because they had a great drama department, and I had become interested in theater. And so during Pledge Week, you know about Pledge Week? fraternity, it was a tradition in fraternities. The first week of school, or really almost before school starts, there's a sort of introductory orientation period. All of the fraternities have parties, and they sort of court people who may want to pledge that fraternity. And so I said, I'm gonna be serious about dating. I didn't know any girls. My father prevailed upon me to take my cousin Leanne to one of these parties. She was, a nice person. I've recently reconnected with her online. She came from a very religious family. No way were we going to make out or anything. And I felt totally alienated from the fraternity experience. The only exception being there was one fraternity that was kind of low in the campus pecking order. And that was the only one where I felt at ease, because there were actually girls there who I could have a conversation with, where I didn't feel I was supposed to be coming on to them, and they were intellectual. And that was really the first time I ever discovered that girls could actually be smart, because the Southern mores are such that girls are taught to be flirtatious with boys and to ask the boys questions and never betray if they have any intellectual side, because boys are put off by that. So you just get the impression that girls in general didn't think much. And this one fraternity party, I met some co-eds, which I assume is kind of an outre term now. But anyway, I had several nice conversations. I felt relatively at home. But around that time, they held auditions for a play for the college theater. And I went and auditioned. Well, actually, what happened was I went and auditioned. And, it was a sort of a successful experience. I got cast in a play, and also got to know the other theater people, and they would all go sit together in the snack bar, and they were kind of the bohemian branch of Birmingham Southern College, and all of a sudden I felt totally at home. Some of them were gay, quasi-openly gay. They weren't talking about it much, but it was fairly obvious, and they weren't trying to pretend to be straight. But nobody was shunned in any way. And meanwhile, though, I met a co-ed, Pam, who we just got on so well that it became a little romance. And we were both in this play, and after rehearsal one weekend night, we went to a party. By the way, I don't know if by any chance you've read my graphic novel, Stuck Rubber Baby. There's so many things I may tell you about that have parallels in that book. I drew on my experience a lot. It's not autobiographical, literally, but in there, the central character goes to his first party that is mixed black and white. And that's based on when Pam and I and the rest of the theater people went to a party at the Gaston Motel, a black motel in Birmingham, which was a central place for a lot of civil rights activism, and there were a lot of blacks there, and it was the first time I ever drank beer, because we came from a teetotaling family, and I was raised to think that if you ever drank your first sip of alcohol, you would become an alcoholic. So it was a big deal for me to drink that first beer. I was really taking my life in my hands. But it was all very comfortable, and the lights were dark, and Pam and I kind of nestled together, and it was the first time I really felt comfortable with a woman. And Pam and I think I may have even, reached inside her pants or something, I don't know, but it was, we really bonded. And Pam and I became sort of everybody's cute sweethearts for a while at college. But then I had this crisis, we decided, okay, tonight's the night we're gonna have sex. And unfortunately, I had a condom that I'd been carrying in my wallet for months, just in case something like this ever happened. And what I didn't know was that if you do that for a long time, the condom often will not unroll. It gets stuck together if it's pre-wet. So it was a fiasco trying to put on a condom, and it was so upsetting that I lost all my confidence in myself, and I finally told her that I was gay. She came from a very liberal, cool family who were civil rights activists. She was white, but they were among the cadre of white civil rights activists in Birmingham. And she was very, accepting, but of course it put a question mark over exactly what kind of relationship we have. And this was right before summer. She went to Mexico during the summer. We exchanged some mail, but I also decided, okay, so now I feel like I've, I should be trying to be straight. We didn't have a exclusive relationship or anything. Not that I was going to have sex with anyone normally, but while she was around. But I tried relating to girls. What I found was that essentially, my relationship with Pam was special. It was emotional. Just trying to date a girl and feel her up was a totally alien experience. And I tried that once with this very smart girl. And we were in some secluded location. And I knew that as a straight guy wants to put their hands on her breast, so I put my hand on her breast. And she said, "Would you mind taking your hand off my breast?" And that ended that little foray. But when Pam came back from Mexico in the fall, we decided to resume our relationship and maybe try again. We didn't succeed until this one occasion when we had been to this talk by out of campus speaker that was incredibly philosophical and thought-provoking and stirring. And afterwards we were just sort of on a high from having heard this talk, and we went off and parked somewhere, and we just spontaneously had sex with no condom involved. And shortly thereafter she told me that she was pregnant. So then we had this whole dilemma. So what do we do about that? I was very pleased that Pam did not want to have an abortion. Not for religious reasons, but she just didn't want to have an abortion. And I was so glad of that because I thought it was her choice. But I didn't want one either, because I thought, well, this may be the only child I'll ever conceive. And Pam is a wonderful person, and I feel like we just had a lot to offer a child. So we decided that she would finish off her pregnancy years in an unwed mother's home, another term that probably they don't use anymore, in Atlanta. And we would give up the child for adoption. And so we did that. I got to see the baby once when it was an infant, shortly after being born. And then she was given up for adoption, and we didn't have any contact until she hit 21, when she tracked down Pam and me, and all of a sudden we were back in touch, and I now have 2 grandchildren.
Congrats.
Well, thank you. I love it on television. If anybody indicates that they have children or grandchildren, the audience always applauds, which I always take it as sort of a celebration of heterosexuality. This
to me is like a celebration of whatever your celebration of you wanting to have been a parent. I read that part.
Oh.
And the breast part too, except that I think you were feeling up a purse.
Oh yeah, that was a different. That was when we were in the movie theater, the earlier double dating situation.
But it's a powerful thing, because there are a lot of gay people, lesbian and gay men, who have that desire and are not sure, or in the past weren't sure how they'd come by it. And it's nice to hear a story like this where that's consummated and you've got grandchildren, the whole thing. So, so congrats again.
But part of the, part of the offshoot of that was that I began to see some of the benefits of gayness because you don't have children. And I decided I needed to explore, after Pam went off to the unwed mother's home in Atlanta, I decided I needed to sort of explore my gay side more. And I had learned where the gay bars were in Birmingham, and I was just about to reach the age when I could walk into a bar. And so anyway, I went back, I made an appointment with my original therapist. And so I told him, I have two pieces of news. One is that I got a girl pregnant. I said, oh, great. And I said, also, I've decided to explore my gay side. And then he launched into, a quiet monologue about what a terrible life I would be leading if I gave into that. That he said the most unhappy people I know are homosexuals, etc. But the thing is, by then I had met some gay people. So I recognized baloney when I heard it. And I just heard him out and left, and that's the last time I ever saw him.
I wonder if he was talking about himself.
I think even putting that possibility aside, he was not making allowances for the fact that the clients of a therapist are self-selected, troubled people. Now, if you're not troubled, you don't go to a therapist. And but when I started going to the gay bar in Birmingham, which was called the Fire Pit, the main gay bar, Birmingham could usually only support 2 gay bars at a time, and maybe a lesbian bar. And so the gay bar, the Fire Pit, basically served as a kind of a community center. It was a place where someone who thought they might be gay, or was feeling gay, could go and not be judged and be around other people who, were gay and cruise and have sex and fulfill those needs. It was very remarkably healthy experience, considering that the popular straight world's view of a gay bar was that really seedy, full of messed up people. Sort of like in the movie, it's a famous movie about a congressman or somebody who is secretly gay, and they have one scene in a gay bar, and it just looks so incredibly depressing. It's a famous movie, but of course, my dysnomia does not allow me to remember the title.
It's not about Roy Cohn, is it?
No, this is no.
Okay.
It wasn't about anybody in particular. It was just fiction. But it is sort of a classic movie of its time. But its picture of the gay life was very depressing. Would make anyone not want to be gay.
Mm-hmm.
But the Fire Pit, the people I met there, was really terrific. I had my first overt sexual experiences with strangers. Now, I left out something. After I was out to Pam, I met some of her friends. There was a high school student. He wasn't even college age yet, but he was the first man I ever met, who was totally frank and unapologetic about being homosexual. I was kind of astonished that anybody could be that way in the world. And that had a big impact. And also another of Pam's friends, this guy named Sam, I had such a crush on. He was also younger. He was still in high school when I first saw him in a school play at his high school, which is where Pam had gone to school. And he was so charismatic on stage. I just thought he was dreamy. And then he came to Birmingham Southern, and he was in the theater department there, and I felt so, well, all I knew is I thought he was really, really good looking and handsome. Well, one time at a cast party, this was after Pam had gone off to Atlanta to have the baby, I got drunk enough, and Sam was drunk enough, that I actually had the nerve to put my arm around him. We were sitting near each other, and he was okay with that. And he took me up to his dorm room. And that was when I had my first overt gay experience that wasn't pretending to be horseplay or something like that. And in retrospect, it was kind of absurd because he was so drunk he practically passed out. But it was the first time I had access to a male body, a naked male body, and that was amazing for me. I immediately fell head over heels in love. And the next day I told him I was in love with him. And he said, you made it clear in a very nice way that no, this was not going anywhere. It was recreational sex. And that's, if you ever get around to reading my graphic novel, you will recognize so many situations that I allude to there. But by then I knew that, okay, I really love snuggling with a naked body. I also learned from my first experiences being taken home from the fire pit that it could be an unpleasant experience. I went home with this guy to whom I was not attracted, but I was so flattered that he wanted to take me home. And he wanted to fuck me. First time I was ever fucked, and it was like, it hurt. It was a really unpleasant experience and highly awkward in terms of our position, legs up. There was just nothing romantic or even friendly about it. He was not mean or anything. I was just a trick. And so,
sounds familiar.
The experience of entering the gay world is always a mix of good experiences with plenty of flubs along the way, and eventually you learn not to draw any permanent conclusions about one bad experience. And but then I got a chance to go to San Francisco. My brother, who is also gay, lived in San Francisco.
Is this Alan?
Yeah.
3 years older than you.
Mm-hmm. And he had actually, the way we came out to each other was, while I was in college, he was in grad school at Emory. And, but he came to Birmingham and we had lunch together. And this was when I just started having, my relationship with Pam. And I sort of told him, I think I may be bisexual. And he was very sympathetic and everything. And then, after an hour or so later, as we were leaving the restaurant, he said, I guess I probably should tell you that I've been living with a guy in San Francisco for several years now. And because he'd gone to grad school in San Francisco. And so then, one of my many times dropping out of school, I dropped out of college 3 times for various reasons. But the third time, I thought maybe San Francisco was the place for me to go. I could live with my brother for a little bit. So I moved in with my brother briefly. I think I was there for about 3 weeks. And had my first experiences in San Francisco. And for my first experiences being in a wholeheartedly gay positive environment.
What year is this?
This was 1966.
Let me backtrack to one other thing.
Okay.
When your brother told you that he was gay, how did you feel? What were your feelings at that moment?
Well, I felt like, I have a mentor. And that's when he told me where the gay bar was in Birmingham. And, gave me some tips. And when we went to San Francisco, he took me to some gay bars there. and I learned some tips about cruising, like don't stand around with your arms across your chest. Let your hands be down. If this says I'm not available, this says you may draw close, and things like that. We went to this leather bar, famous one turned out, called the Toolbox. It was famous at the time. And my brother was not a leather guy, but it was a sort of cool place. But anyway, this guy, this very sort of masterful, dominant guy, came over to me very nicely. He reached over and took off my glasses. He said, "Never wear these in here again." So, with the next few weeks, I got contact lenses. So anyway, but I was the belle of the ball because I was, 21 years old, new in town, going to all the gay bars. There's nothing like youth. It can cover up a lot of imperfections.
Let me just ask you a question about, actually, let me go back to your brother for one moment.
Okay.
So this is presumption on my part, because I think of how I would have felt if I was trying to navigate sexual waters and saying I'm bisexual, and then an older brother said, "I'm gay. I'm with a man."
Actually, he didn't say he was gay. He
Uh-huh.
said, "I've been living with a man."
It seems to me that for me personally, I would have been like, okay, I don't have to do this anymore. I'm just going to go that route. It sounds like you didn't. You were still between Pam and this other place.
Yeah, because Pam's was a real relationship. It was a loving relationship.
Yep.
And I went through a last-minute panic as time came for the baby to arrive. We stayed in contact. At those unwed mothers' homes, you were required to have a pseudonym, so there would be no documentary record that you'd been here. So she had a pseudonym, but she and I would exchange letters. And it sort of hit me that this was probably the only time in my life I would ever have a child. And I didn't want to give it up. So I drove out over to Atlanta, where Pam and I could visit in a very supervised situation. And I proposed to her. Of course, she knew I was gay, but I thought maybe there's some way we could make that work. And she was very sweet about it. And then a few days later, I got a call from her mother, also a wonderful, wonderful person, still a political activist at, well into her 90s. She asked if I could come over to their house in Birmingham. And so I did. And she sort of very quietly and compassionately told me she didn't think it would be a good idea for us to get married. And in my heart, I knew she was right.
Mm-hmm.
It was asking for disaster.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to do the right thing, and I wanted to not lose track of my baby, but it would have been she was an actress, Pam was an actress, and it would have been two people in, precarious careers trying to raise a child. That would have just, that's asking for trouble. I could not support a baby, she could not support a baby. So the right decision was made, the baby was given up for adoption. And but all through the years that followed, Pam and I both, we didn't have much contact because she was married for a while to another guy, and I thought I should not intrude into that relationship. But then they got divorced, and she came through. I was living in New York by then, and she came through, and we reconnected. And all of the good things in our relationship were still there, and all of the insecurities of adolescence and stuff like that had, were mellowed out, and we've been good friends ever since. Now I had a train of thought going, but I lost the train of thought. Do you remember anything like what I was saying?
It doesn't seem that you're off the path at all. It's just there's the potential to go in so many directions because of anything, right?
Yeah.
But you were in San Francisco,
Yeah.
and you were the belle of the ball. It's 1966. Let me just ask about San Francisco in 1966, pre-Summer of Love. Did you notice any of that underworld going on at that point?
No, there were people who would make references to Haight-Ashbury, to all the Beatniks on Haight-Ashbury. The terms flower child, hippie, and stuff like that hadn't gotten into the public consciousness yet. So they were just thought of as hippies. Of course, San Francisco was a center of the Beatnik culture too. You had the Ferlinghetti, the bookstore, where he would do readings, and Ginsberg would do readings, etc. And and there was, everyone talked about Ken Kesey was on the lam from the law. And I would see references to acid experiences, but I didn't know what that was about. And so after I'd been there for a few weeks, I'd made a few little forays to get freelance cartooning work. And I got a call from Dr. Powell, who was the director of the Colors Theater in Birmingham Southern, and who had become a sort of surrogate father after my father died, and a mentor, and stayed a mentor long after I left college. But he called me up and he said, if you will come back to school, you can design all 3 sets for the upcoming plays next year. And also, they had just finally established an official drama department that you could major in. Before that, theater had only been an extracurricular activity. And so I went through several majors. I was an English major. I was a math major briefly. I was an English major, and I was an art major, and none of them were satisfactory experiences, which was one of the reasons I was motivated to drop out. But with a drama major possibility, and doing the sets, which I would be paid for as a student assistant, that took me back to Birmingham. And so I finished my college career. I had 2 more years there. And let's see now, how do I get back to somewhere?
So let me intervene for a moment, because this is a very strong background and template of what those years were like for you, and now we're in the early 66, actually mid-60s. I'd like to talk about your introduction to more into the counterculture, psychedelics, and the sort of effect that had on you, where you found yourself in the hippie movement, even though you were not in the Summer of Love. You actually, believe it or not, you were in San Francisco when most people say that was the best year to be there. It was the Summer of Love was a drag.
Well, Summer of Love, yeah, right. But it was very glorified by a song like, if you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear a flower in your hair, etc., which drew 1 million runaways to San Francisco and turned Haight-Ashbury into a crazy place. But in the fall of 1967, marijuana reached Birmingham Southern. And, my crowd was all experimenting with marijuana. I never became a big pothead because I had never smoked cigarettes, and it didn't feel comfortable to pull smoke into my... I did it some, and I knew what it was like to have a pot high, but it didn't change my life or anything. But then after, in the new semester, in the fall of 68, which was my senior year, acid reached Birmingham. And I was wary, but then, of course, all these articles about LSD, it was all in the media, there were all these scare stories, terrible. You'll jump out of a window. But then some of my crowd took the plunge, and they would come in on a Sunday morning after a Saturday night with their eyeballs spinning and say, "You wouldn't believe it. It was incredible. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience." And it didn't square with the horror stories of bad trips and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. I was resistant because I've always been very protective of my mind. It was the center of my creative life. I was scared something would mess up my mind, so I held off. But then so many of my friends seemed to be doing fine, so I tried it one time, and I came away feeling the same way they did. It was transformative experiences. I couldn't believe how wonderful the hallucinations were, how much it seemed to be a doorway into an alternate reality that raised questions about exactly what is the reality of the normal life as opposed to what you're experiencing when you're tripping. And I became a fairly frequent tripper during my senior year in college. It's a good thing that it didn't reach earlier, because I don't think I could have sustained a productive senior year if I'd been so tempted to trip all the time. But
how is it transformative?
For one thing, just in terms of your acquaintance with a level of sensuality that if you were a buttoned-down kid like me, even having come out, I didn't realize one could feel that level of sensuality, not just sexuality, but sensuality, head to toe. And as an artist, I was seeing the world through these hallucinations that just begged for me to find a way to expand my cartooning life, my creative life, in a way to encompass the notion that there were visions you could have that were not limited to the constructs of the art that you had been doing up till then, which was based on the tropes of everyday life. And there was this strong feeling that it helps you understand how your mind worked better. Things that were unconscious normally, you would see, oh, this is what's happening here. Here's this barrier I have, but it can be transcended. Here's this thing I'm frightened of, but it can be faced down. It was while I was tripping the first time I ever really, grieved for my father's death. I had been very stoic at the time that he died. But just this wellspring of emotion, it just freed me up emotionally in a lot of ways.
How, if at all, do you feel that the psychedelic experience may have informed your sexuality?
Well,
if at all.
Well, I think if you're accustomed to not being totally comfortable with some interior part of yourself, and then you trip, basically your interior self will make its presence felt whether you want it to or not. Understand, I still had not freed myself from some residual internalized homophobia. As I've often analyzed it, the difference between the gay scene in Birmingham in 1966 and the gay scene in San Francisco in 66 was that in Birmingham, basically, there was a general communal feeling that we all have a deficiency, but we can still have a good life. We can have fun, we can have a community, even if we are in some way, emotionally deformed. San Francisco was the first place that everyone just seemed very happy to be gay. And so it didn't have an instant effect, but later on, to make a quick jump over a period that I'm going to jump back to.
Sure.
I spent 8 months living in New York after I dropped out of grad school. I went to Penn State for one term, hated it. No fault of Penn State. It was a fine school, but I was not in a graduate school state of mind. And I lived with friends in New York, and it was the height of the counterculture. But then I did a lot of tripping and had other good experiences. But then I went back to Birmingham because it also took a toll, because I was really not yet competitive as a cartoonist in a city like New York, which is so full of talent. And so I went back to Birmingham sort of feeling like bummed out because I hadn't been able to make it in New York. But shortly after I returned to Birmingham at the tail end of 1969, I fell in love with a fellow named Don Higdon, a Birmingham guy. He was then still in school at Birmingham Southern and was also a drama major. And we moved in together, and we tripped a lot. And it was really while I was tripping with him that I had this appearance where I felt I flushed out the last of my internalized homophobia. It was, what prompted it specifically was we decided it'd be fun to take a bath together. We had a bathtub. We sat facing each other in a bathtub and were tripping. And we had a record playing in the other room. At that time there was this Tiny Tim record, God Bless Tiny Tim. And anyway, hearing Tiny Tim's voice, the trilling, very effeminate sounding voice, it brought up old fears of being effeminate. But meanwhile, I was hallucinating, looking into Don's eyes. And Don his face was just mutating, 100 times a second. And sometimes it would seem female and sometimes it would seem male. But it was always Don. And it was loving. And I finally realized that there was absolutely nothing wrong with being gay. Zero. It's perfectly healthy. And I came out of that trip very exhilarated over that epiphany.
Did it last?
Yeah, I mean, after that, one thing I was no longer dealt with was the feeling there was something wrong with me. And it was, as time went on, I began to realize that I was very angry over the hell I had been put through throughout adolescence and, over and to the point of attempting suicide. This trip that had been laid on me by society. And that's when I began to think I want to be political.
And perfect timing. I wanted to also bring into this where your political consciousness was in the 60s, whether civil rights or anti-war or other things as well.
Basically, during most of the 60s, I was sympathetic with this civil rights movement. I was on the side of the integrationists from my safe perch, first at Indian Springs and then at Birmingham Southern College. I didn't see myself as a person who would be demonstrating in the streets. I'd never done that in any other context. Being a street activist was just not part of my experience. And but Pam was, and Pam and her family, would be part of marches, and so were other of the more woke people I was around. And basically, if you spent a lot of time in Alabama, you felt like politics was a lost cause. Birmingham would never change. It was too totally grounded. The politics were awful. John Patterson, George Wallace, all of these, ironclad, Bull Connor, all these ironclad segregationists, it seemed like you could not change Alabama. And then in '63, you had the church bombing, 16th Street Baptist Church. And it felt like, to this white boy, that this was a turning point. It felt like the white population of Birmingham that was, retrievable, was not ready to see children killed in Sunday school. Sort of like the current thing we're going through, where the feeling is we are not ready to see babies snatched out of their mother's arms and taken away.
Mm-hmm. It
was just, no way could you square that bombing with Christian beliefs. And slowly, it's not that Birmingham was instantly transformed, but it's like the wind went out of the sails of the segregation resistance. And I had basically, before then, that happened in '63, I'd been being in the theater. I had a feeling that art had the capability of changing people in a way that politics didn't. Because art bypasses, if it's done well, bypasses the rational side and goes in the back of your head and makes you think differently. So I sort of thought, and that's sort of the belief that Dr. Powell had. So I felt like, okay, I need to do art that is, we didn't use the term yet, consciousness expanding, but that, art that would raise people's understanding of ways other than those that they'd been brought up with. But in the rest of the years that I was in Birmingham, through the time I left in '68, Birmingham changed. Not all wonderful, but it desegregated. You had, the federal government said you have to desegregate, but it was not an automatic recipe for, horrible racist mobs. And people learned that it was not the end of the world if they, were going to school if white people were going to school next to black people. And Birmingham Southern integrated. And Indian Springs integrated. It took longer for Indian Springs because there were some rock rib segregationists who were on the board of governors. So despite the fact that it was a progressive school, if they hadn't been there, I think it would have integrated much sooner. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, they died or moved on or something, and you had leadership that was willing to end that, and also to make it a co-ed school, to let girls in. So Indian Springs changed, Birmingham changed, and a lot of that was because people had seen demonstrators being hosed down in the streets and having bombs thrown and all that stuff. And I realized street activism was a real thing that could make a difference. Mm-hmm. This barely caused me to take any actions. I did, shortly before I graduated, I did participate in an anti-war march. But it was, small by standards of the marches you would have in New York or somewhere. But it was a set of people walking down, the middle, probably on a sidewalk. I doubt that Birmingham police would let you walk in the middle of the street. Are we running out of time?
No. I have to keep making sure levels are good. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Don't let that dissuade you.
Okay. But anyway, then I went to Penn State.
Let me just see. It's right there?
Is it still here?
Let me take a look.
Tell me if you can are you still picking me up okay?
And go ahead, talk, yeah?
Okay.
Go right ahead.
Okay. So I went to Penn State, and I was unhappy there. Well, actually, what happened was I lost confidence. I went there on a playwriting fellowship. It was a fairly prestigious playwriting fellowship, because by then I'd been writing plays. I put on plays at Birmingham Southern that I had written. And I kind of saw myself as moving through life in the mold of Dr. Powell. I would get an MFA in theater. I would be an academic theater person, and like he was, and that's the track I thought I was on. However, if you're on a playwriting fellowship to grad school, obviously you're supposed to be writing plays. And I got a writer's block. I did write 2 plays while I was there, one of which is I still claim, the other I would be embarrassed to see. I dread it being discovered by anybody who looks at my archives at Columbia. Basically I was overcome with this feeling that I have not had enough life experience. All of my experience has been in school. I don't have things to say to a world that is not in school. All of my plays, which were impressive as student plays, but they were very influenced by other playwrights. And I needed to just live life for a while before I tried to write a play. And this didn't square with being a graduate student in playwriting. And so I told them I had to leave. And fortunately, they were able to transfer the rest of my scholarship to another aspiring playwright who had gone there, even though he was only a runner-up. And so they gave the rest of my fellowship to him. So that made me feel less guilty about throwing away my fellowship. And I moved in with Birmingham Southern friends who had, during the interim, moved to New York City and had kind of a crash pad there. And so several of us lived there. People would come through from Birmingham.
What street was this on?
Well, actually, it was not like any place truly hippie area. It was on East 14th Street, just at borderline of Greenwich Village, in the East Village.
Sure.
But it still felt like a crash pad because it was so ungoverned in terms of who might show up and sleep there. Except it was mostly people from our circle of friends, or refugees from Alabama, or wasn't just total strangers. And I also, paradoxically, during my senior year in college, I had a heterosexual affair with a girl named Julie, which was, it just kind of happened because we were such good friends, and we, actually she was not much of a stoner, but I was experimental, and she, and when I moved to New York, and she knew I was gay. So unlike the situation with Pam, where it started off with me trying desperately to be straight, Julie knew I was gay. She was fine with that. She knew I would be going off to cruise in Greenwich Village once in New York, and I'd be going to gay bars in Birmingham, but we also had a very hot sexual relationship. And then she was in New York. She was basically the leaseholder of the apartment that we were staying in on East 14th Street. And so I resumed my sexual relationship with her, but also cruised and had gay sex. And it was during that period in '69 that I had my encounter with the Stonewall riots that you know about, where I.
But let's chat about them. Let me go back for 1 second, and then we'll get right back into your Central Park story. With this sexual affair that you had that year, did that feel to you to contradict the expunging of the homosexuality on that trip, or was it a comfortable fit?
It was just in counterpoint, equal counterpoint. What I've learned over the years is I'm capable, at least, I don't think it would be true now, but while I was still young and my hormones were raging, I was capable of having heterosexual sex with a good friend, with someone I was comfortable with, who I wasn't pretending that I was straight. But I had no drive to have, for women. So I never felt I was bisexual. To me, a bisexual would be someone who had both a drive to have heterosexual sex and a drive to have homosexual sex.
My husband.
And so anyway, that was just this odd interval for somebody who's a gay activist, you know. Remember when Holly Near got in trouble for having a heterosexual relationship for a while?
She was a has-been. That's what my friends in Northampton refer to her as still. She's a has-been. It's like, come on, give her a break.
I know. I mean, she's just as talented as ever. She's just as committed to the gay movement as ever. And but because of my experience, I always saw the injustice of that. I thought the absurdity of trying to throw away someone who is as important as Holly Near just because they didn't hew to a line. The same is true. There's a cartoonist named Roberta Gregory, who was a pioneering lesbian underground comic artist. And so she was a pioneer in that area, but for a while she was living with a guy. And a set of people thought, oh, that's a betrayal.
I think I heard that also about Tom Robinson from the Tom Robinson Band. Oh, we're glad to be gay. It was like he came to the San Francisco parade, I guess, in '81 or something. Okay, but that's an interesting, the idea of it being a counterpoint in the way you described it. Okay, so let's bring it up to 1969 June, a particular day. Tell me what happened.
Well, it was a weekend. I mean, a weekend was coming up. It was a Friday, and a bunch of us, we worked in the same place. It was a typesetting company. Julie was a typesetter, and she had gotten her friends jobs as proofreaders, and I was a paste-up artist. And so we decided we're going to trip tonight, and so we decided it would be fun to go up to Central Park, where there was going to be a Tiny Tim concert. We didn't have tickets. We couldn't afford tickets. But it was going to be amplified, so we could sit outside the rink, which is...
Schaefer Music Festival?
Once you got... I don't know. All I know is it was a Woolman rink.
Right. That's... They refer to... Yeah.
Okay. So we went and sat on the grass outside and heard Tiny Tim's voice trilling through the air. And, and it was all very mellow and pleasant. And then when this concert was over, we were still tripping. So we thought, okay, so now we'll go down to Greenwich Village and walk around. So we took a cab down to Greenwich Village, and we're strolling around and happened to pass Christopher Street. And there was this clamor going on. By then, of course, it was after midnight, so it was technically Saturday now. And we walked over and watched the clamor some, but we didn't know what was happening. We're not rooted in reality, and we had no sense that it was dangerous to stand on the edge of a fighting mob. So we just watched for a while. It was very interesting, and didn't know what the significance was. Didn't feel the need to know because we were tripping. Eventually we might figure it out, but then we went and strolled elsewhere in the village. Ran into this guy from the Midwest, this really sweet guy who had that irresistible corn-fed look and voice. Everybody, we chatted with him, and we mentioned there's this whole thing going on Christopher Street. We don't know what that's about. And he said he thought he would go over and see what that was about. And we nicknamed him after we never got his name. We nicknamed him Hayseed affectionately. Anyway, so finally we went back to Julie's apartment when we were coming down. And the next morning we got the New York Times, and there was a story about what had happened at Stonewall. And that's when we realized, we saw something that was actually important. And then, of course, there was more coverage during the week. The Village Voice ran a snarky article about it. Queen Bee's sting or something like that. And But the thing that was memorable particularly was how quickly, almost instantly, flyers went up around town about gay liberation. Meetings, announcing meetings. It got political real fast. I didn't go to those because I didn't think of myself as a street activist. But I thought it was very interesting that was happening. And I approved of it. And meanwhile, I was wrapped up in myself and my own problems about I wasn't making it in New York and was I going to go back to Alabama. And ultimately I did go back in September and got a job at a local TV station as an art director mainly. I directed a little bit, but that was too stress-producing a role for me. Because it's not like directing in theater. It's like pushing buttons on live television. You have to be ready at every second. So I was transferred to the art department, and I stayed there for several years. And it was during that period I had gotten together with Don. And that Don came. I'm getting my chronology mixed up. Sorry, posterity. Okay, 69, then the 70s. Yes, I got together with Don. Right, okay. But then in the middle, in 1973, Don and I broke up. It was not an acrimonious breakup. It was heartbreaking for me because I thought we were good for life. But we were heading in a different track. Don wanted to concentrate on his acting, and I was getting more political. We went to a gay pride march in Atlanta in 73, and it was scary to be out on the street. We were not in big enough numbers to feel totally safe. Some people did the thing, and they had paper bags over their heads because they didn't want to lose their jobs. But it was my first time to do anything political about gay things. And I'd already decided, okay, sometime I want to bring gayness into my underground comics. But I want to do it after I've established myself, to a general audience. Because I didn't want to be typecast as, the gay cartoonist who's trying to ride, this gimmick to fame or something. So I did not come out in my comics for several years. But I told Don, I said, I want to ultimately bring gay stuff into my comics. And but after Don and I broke up, I spent a little while in Atlanta, and then I moved back to Birmingham, where a big number of my gay friends were. And while I was in Birmingham, I got a job at an ad agency and worked there for a while. And during that period, I subscribed to the Rolling Stone. And the Rolling Stone published an article by the guy whose pseudonym was John Reed, who wrote the book The Best Little Boy in the World. I had this article in the Rolling Stone called The Best Little Gay Magazine in the World. And it was about the Advocate. And so I subscribed to the Advocate. And that's where I began to see articles about what was happening with the gay liberation movement in New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles and various places. And I began to feel frustrated being in Birmingham, where there was nothing like that going on. And I decided I want to be part of that.
What year is this about now?
Well, we're in 74, 75.
Okay. Let me go back a little bit, backtrack, and then we'll bring it back to 74, 75. So there's two things I want to... Let's start with, when you were watching the riot at Stonewall, what were you seeing? What was... I know you're tripping, so you may have been seeing more than was actually there, but what was your... What was happening?
I mean, I couldn't have described it. It was just a furor. It was a bunch. It was clamor. But the thing is, I was no stranger to the Stonewall. That was my favorite gay bar.
Talk about the Stonewall.
So I liked it because it was somewhat countercultural. It was not rigid about being just all about beefy guys. It was, there were the counterculture and gay sensibility had been intertwining, so that you had this concept called gender fuck, which was drag, except you didn't try to hide that you were a man. You would have men in makeup and women's clothes and beards. And this went along with what was happening in rock and roll. You had Andy Warhol's crowd doing their thing. And there was a general permission for men not to be so uptight about looking like men. And at the Stonewall, they had great go-go boys who would dance on the bar and their little Speedos. And, and I went home with some interesting people from there. So generally it was a very amiable place to go out if you want to go cruising. And I went home, one of my memorable experiences, I went home with a guy who lived in New Jersey, but he had a car. So we drove to New Jersey. When I went to the bar, and when we left the bar, it was snowing. But it turned out it was going to be a historic blizzard. It was the blizzard that basically ended the political career of John Lindsay, the mayor, because people were dissatisfied. They felt that he didn't clean up the streets in the outer boroughs as much as Manhattan. But all I experienced as, it's a big snowstorm. It was a hassle getting home, because I would have been futile for him to drive me home. So I'd get to the train station and subway in and trudge through knee-deep snow. But it was just, an odd little brush with something that became an important historical event, aside from Stonewall. And so anyway, I was used to drag queens. I had no impulse to be one, but I was used to it. I did not feel alienated in any way.
Do you remember any of the drag queens there?
No, I didn't. I knew the only people I would get to know would be people that, that I had sustained relationships with, and that almost didn't happen in gay bars. We had a very nice time, but there was always this tendency to feel like next time you went out, it wasn't, I'm going to go out again with that guy, because who knows who else is very sexy today. Later on, when I moved back to New York in '77 and I was doing the gay bars, that's where I realized I have to find environments that are not all about cruising, where there are gay people. And it was in one of those environments, a place called Identity House, that I met Eddie, who's been my lover ever since.
Very nice.
But to jump back to the 70s, or 60s, or whenever.
I was going to just throw in there as well, it's you mentioned one of the things that you like about Stonewall is, I guess, this cross-pollination of the gay and counterculture scenes together. And that seemed to work for you, because you were something of a hippie, I suppose.
I looked like a hippie. I wore bell bottoms. I tripped a lot.
Did you go to the Fillmore East?
I don't think I ever went inside. I would pass it. I was a little intimidated. That music was very loud. I was not confident that I was hip enough to belong in Fillmore East. But I was very aware of its existence.
How about Woodstock that summer?
Well, that was one of the other three. I've mentioned there was Stonewall, Woodstock, and the Moonshot were the big landmark events for that summer. When Stonewall was approaching, the movie Monterey Pop was out. So everybody had gone to see that and thought, that looks like a really cool experience, and wow, all the stars they had. And then posters started going up for the Woodstock Music Festival, and the line of stars dwarfed Monterey Pop. just astonishing. All the stars were going to be there. And I thought, whoa, I wish I could go to that. But it was out of town. And then some Alabama friends were coming up. Some of our hippie-ish crowd. And they asked if they could stay at Julie's while they were on their way to Woodstock. And they asked if we'd like to come along. And I kind of thought, I got enough of camping out in Boy Scouts. It looked like a lot of work, the camping, and nobody knew what an event. I mean, you knew it was going to be a great concert, but you knew what a cultural event it was going to be, and also what a mess it was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sort of glad. I don't think I would have wanted to live in mud for 3 days. But anyway, so we demurred, and they went on up there. And a few days later, they came back through, asked if they could stop by and take showers. And they were like, you just would not believe. It's like the first time somebody came in from tripping in Birmingham Southern. They said, this was just astonishing. It was an astonishing experience. And so we knew we had missed something. I feel like I got enough of it seeing the movie later on. But the next week, Julie and I and our other friends from East 14th Street were strolling around in the village. We weren't tripping at the moment. And, in those days, if you had long hair, you automatically were assumed to be an ally of the counterculture. This was before truck drivers and construction workers started growing their hair long. It was a marker, it was a political marker of being sympathetic with hippies if you weren't a hippie yourself. So everybody was friendly. If you looked like hippies, people were friendly with you. Give the victory sign on the street to strangers. So we're walking along the street in Greenwich Village, and in a second floor apartment, there was a party going on. And somebody was sitting in the window. And he saw us walking by and said, hey, want to come up to the party? So, why not? We went up to the party. And after we'd been there for a while, a guy came in with a knapsack that was full of LSD from Woodstock. Orange Sunshine, to be specific, which had a deserved reputation as just the best acid anybody ever had, short of Sandoz official pure acid.
Sure.
And it was cheap. I mean, he had a knapsack full of it. And so we bought, enough to hold us for the rest of the summer. And it was so strong that a single tab you could, cut into 4 pieces and have a bang-up trip with a quarter up tab. So anyway, that was another connection I had to the Woodstock experience.
Nice.
And then what I remember about the moonshot, by that time I had moved out of Julie's. The last couple months I was in New York in '69. I had an apartment on West 15th Street. And one time I took acid. I thought it would be interesting to take acid while the moonshot was going on. So I took acid and I went down to Washington Square and just kind of was amazed because men were walking on the moon at that moment.
Which I watched as an 8-year-old at my grandmother's house in Queens Village.
And I met this very nice guy who was, he was a mature man, not, I guess he was probably in his 40s or something, but we had a nice conversation, and I was much more sort of freewheeling and open when I was tripping to anybody. I wasn't deciding whether I find them really sexy or not. He was a perfectly vital guy, middle-aged guy, and went home with him, and had a pleasant time. But I just remember chatting with him. I don't think he was tripping. Maybe he was. Just chatting about how amazing it was that human beings were on the moon at that very moment. So that was another of my experiences.
In the counterculture, and then right after this, well, then I want to ask you more about your first gay march, which I'm presuming is '73 in Atlanta.
That was the first one.
Okay, because I want to get the sort of the sights and sounds of that as well. You're connected to the counterculture yourself. Did you experience any homophobia in the counterculture? Did you find the counterculture to be accepting or open to gays or hostile or a mix? What was your sense?
Well, it was officially, if it feels good, do it, But there was homophobia. I didn't run into it in the sense of anyone saying nasty things. It's just you had a sense. There was a real valuing of machismo. The underground comics, by then I was doing underground comics and a fan of all the underground comics. And some of them would have sliding references to gay people. And it was just all added to their butch allure in their eyes. And so I felt a little alienated from that. But not enough to other things about counterculture were fine with. And, I had that, eventually I'm centering myself a little bit because I don't want to go on perpetual record saying anything unpleasant about anybody specific by name. But no, it didn't. It was not welcoming officially, although, as you've noted, it was kind of straight guys were more willing to experiment with gay sex than they would have been before. We had a close friend of our little circle who had gay sex of some sort. I wasn't part of it during a trip. But apparently he had some sort of real panic reaction afterwards, and he really withdrew. He was not hostile, but he just sort of stopped being part of our circle much. And there was an outlier among the seemingly straight male underground cartoonists was Rand Holmes. I don't know if he was a Canadian cartoonist.
How do you spell his last name?
Holmes. He had a character named Harold Head. Most of the stories were very, typically underground and very, heterosexual. However, he was an outlier in that he published two very affirmative, gay positive strips in the Canadian underground paper. One of them, he had Harold Head, his character. They were ridiculing the book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex But Were Afraid to Ask. You ever see that book? It's an awful homophobic book, pretending to be a progressive liberal book about sex. But its chapter on homosexuality is probably damaged people.
That's interesting. I don't remember that part.
Yeah. Well, he said things like homosexuality. The homosexual world is just a parade of penises. Anyway, there's a whole generation of gay men who could quote that line from that book. It was so disappointing because the rest of the book was cool about sex. Mm-hmm. Rand Holmes published a thing in which his character Harold Head was, sitting around with a male friend in bed. They were looking at that book, and he just was ridiculing, making fun of it. And he ended it by giving the guy he was with a blowjob. And this is a very, a heterosexual character seemingly, who had had sex with lots of women in the other comics, but he did this, and it was very upfront and a startling thing for what you thought of as a straight male to do. It turned out he was bisexual, I later learned. He also volunteered to do the cover art for the first issue of Gay Comics, when he still was not out even as bisexual to the world, but he did that without hesitation. And he was sort of a star cartoonist, so it was a real coup to get him. And it sort of established that, this is not a fringe, underground comic. This has got real solid people in it. It had Roberta Gregory was in it, and Lee Mars, a bunch of familiar female cartoonists too, because I wanted it to be not to be a boys' club series. It didn't know it was going to be a series. We just thought it was going to be a single issue at first. So once again, trying to find myself somewhere in the chronology. So in 77, actually in 76, I was working at this ad agency, but I realized I'm never going to be able to have a real cartooning career, a mainstream cartooning career, based in Birmingham. There just was not enough publishing. And I decided I would move back to New York, this time with my eyes open about the competition level and about the fact that your lifestyle would have to be more Spartan, because, I had a nice apartment in Birmingham for like $200 a month, and a rare New York apartment. At the time, the Upper West Side had not become gentrified yet, so actually I was able to get an apartment, a studio apartment for $210 a month, which a couple of years later would have been ridiculous. Could not have happened. But by then I had met Eddie, and we had decided to move to Queens. But I moved in. I went, moved up with a little bit of a grub stake. A friend of mine from Birmingham, who was a comics fan, and he bought a bunch of my original artwork, so I would have money when I went to New York. And I stayed with a friend in New York for a few weeks till I could get an apartment. And I got my apartment on the Upper West Side, Broadway and West 70th Street. And, it was within blocks of John and Yoko. People would run into them at the grocery store. I never did. But then, and then I I'd been there a couple of years, and I met Eddie. I had just renewed my lease. Eddie, meanwhile, had been in a 10-year marriage to a woman, and he had decided he had to live gay. And so he had just left her 6 weeks before when we met at Identity House, this gay discussion group. And we hit it off in a really nice way. I appreciated the fact that he was a person that I could have a serious conversation about things other than flighty gay things. And I just recently seen while in Birmingham, I had visited my second grade teacher in a nursing home who had Alzheimer's, and had been very upset to see her in the state she was in. She was totally out of control, sort of thrashing around in bed and didn't know what was going on, and her hair was all a mess. And she had been she was a good teacher and had always been very well groomed and dignified, and I knew she would have hated it to know people could see her like that. But and I talked to Eddie about that, and Eddie worked with the aging as part of it. He had a job with social services in New York City, and so we could talk about gerontology issues and not just gay issues. And he was a person of substance, and but he was temporarily living in an apartment he couldn't stay in. His aunt had died, and he was living in her apartment until the building figured out, hey, wait a minute, you're not on the lease. And he knew he was going to have to move out, and the question was, is he going to get an apartment for one person or for two people? And we decided to move in 6 weeks after we met, totally against all common sense. And Of course, in my apartment, I could get out of the lease easily because they love it when you change, when tenants change, because then they can raise the rent. And so I'm going to briefly interrupt you because I've got to go pee.
Okay, hold on one sec. And we are continuing. Are we continuing? Yes, we are continuing.
Okay. Now, jumping back briefly to the 60s.
One second. Let me just make sure I'm hearing you well. Nothing's changed. Sorry to who is ever transcribing this. Go ahead.
Okay, I can. How about it coming through? Is this coming through okay?
Yep, very good. Thank you.
When I came out to start going to gay bars in 1965, particularly. Actually, I went to the fire pit had a front section that was a coffee shop sort of, and you went into the back, and that was a gay bar.
Mm.
So I was tantalized by the existence of the fire pit, but I couldn't legally go in and have beer or whatever. But I would go sit and read a book in the front section, have a cup of coffee, read a book, soak up the people who were walking past to go into the back. But for a long time, I bought into the popular opinion that basically gay people didn't have long-term relationships. And then one time, I was invited home for a threesome by these two guys. And we had a nice time. And then talking about their life they led, it became clear that there was this whole other world of gay couples that socialized with each other. That weren't, if they were going to the gay bars at all, they were not announcing they were in a couple. So it's very easy to believe there were no gay couples, because it was the straight ones or the ones who were straight for the night. I mean, not straight. Singles, people who were single for the night, or totally single, who were the ones you met in the gay bars in Birmingham. And so it was educational for me to realize, there's all these gay couples I never see, and they have barbecues, and they visit with each other, and they have parties, blah, blah, blah. So one of the interesting things about being older is that you become aware of the long span of people's lives, the long arc of people's lives. People that I knew, as teenagers, who now, are reaching retirement age. They've had careers. I knew them when they didn't know what their life was going to hold, and then I saw them develop, and I just find that endlessly interesting about just appreciating the human experience. So anyway, that was my little observation
about that statement about gay relationships not lasting and what you end up seeing. Yeah.
Because basically that everything you always want to know about sex, blah, 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 said there was no such thing as loving gay relationships.
Yeah. I could go off, but I'm not. And of course, I mean, that does affect people. I mean, I remember wondering and thinking that as well. I mean, given the divorce rate, you could say that about any heterosexual couple, right? Or about heterosexuality in general. I mean, it's just, it's an unexamined aspect of the straight world itself.
Mm-hmm.
Look at your relationships,
And most of my college friends who are married successfully, it's their second marriage. It just is, this is my relationship with Eddie is my second marriage. I learned things. You're more mature. You know what to expect better.
Yeah, yes. And also, there's a lot of people who are the answer to that particular statement anyway.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. I wanted to bring us into the 70s. I wanted to have you just chat a little bit more about your first Gay Pride March in Atlanta. It was small. There were people with how you felt, and how your gay consciousness or political consciousness changed or didn't change from Stonewall on, and then into the comics.
Well, I mean, I was just feeling more and more. I mean, when I was living in Atlanta, particularly after Don and I broke up, and I was going to Atlanta gay bars. But in general, I just felt more part of the gay community. And I appreciated the sense of community that you had with the people who were doing things like having marches. And so when I heard that there was a gay march coming up, and I mean, that was actually when I was still with Don. It was very late in our relationship. But we both marched in that. It was, like I said, it was a little unnerving. I think we had about 500 people, and probably more people standing on the sidewalk watching. If anybody had wanted to run out in the street and start hitting us, they could have. But I felt really good about the experience. Don was disinclined to do more of that because he wanted to invest his total energy in his art, which was acting. And Don had never had a chance to be a single gay person. He moved out of his parents' home into living with me. He was never on his own before that, before we broke up.
God bless you.
Thank you. And so, there were good reasons for us to break up, but it tore me up at the time. And getting together with Eddie, it was a calmer. It was not flooded with the heightened romance mixed with psychedelics and all of that. I was looking for someone I could enjoy the company of for a long time.
And I think the psychedelic experience is beginning. Certainly, the counterculture is fading.
Yeah. The quality of the acid went down. There's more of the dealers were in it for money, and they were happy to, put adulterants in it. So I wasn't getting the experiences that were the reason that I enjoyed it. I was not interested in the partying experiences. Once I learned what it offered in terms of spiritual exploration. And so Don and I would trip, just the two of us, and he would, go do his, he was also an artist. He would draw pictures. Typically, once it was going enough, mainly you can't draw when you're in the middle of tripping. I mean, what's one thing I learned. There's a folder of stuff that's at Columbia that's, drawings drawn on LSD. They look like they were done by a 5-year-old. You don't have motor control. But in the aftermath, thinking back on the experience and still in the glow of it, it would affect my art and affect his. But one particularly memorable trip, he was going to be in a production of Othello. He had a minor role, a soldier, sort of spear carrier role in Othello. But during the trip, he imagined the whole backstory of that soldier and managed to give a really rich performance that didn't have all that many lines, And probably the audience didn't know how rich it was, but I knew that he was entering that performance with the memories of all these childhood memories of that soldier and stuff like that. And one of the experiences I would have while tripping was I would look at my cartoons and they would be animated. They would move around. That was a lovely experience, and I would get insights into my characters. I would realize what was really funny about a particular character, because I would see him acting out his funniness on the page. Anyway, that's But but Eddie didn't want to be political. I did. And so I went to New York so I could be political. I started being political in my art while I was still in Birmingham, and I did that story you saw, Gravy on Gay, which I did with great trepidation. It was something short of fully coming out of the closet, because I did not say, I, the artist, am gay. The character was gay. Could have just been a, liberal, straight guy doing his bit for the gay movement. Like Gary Trudeau putting in a gay character in Doonesbury. But I was, scared what it would do to my career if I was out. And so this was dipping my toe into being out, but not quite being out. And when I was reassured that, I think anybody who had any sense would feel like, oh, no straight guy would do this story. So in a sense, I was coming out, but not explicitly. But I became aware that a lot of people, particularly in the underground comics world, they looked at me differently, but not in a bad way. So then in 1979, Dennis Kitchen, my publisher, if you write this down, it's Dennis with one N.
What's the last name?
Kitchen.
Like kitchen.
Yeah.
Kitchen.
He's now my agent. He had a company called Kitchen Sink Books and Kitchen Sink Comics.
Very good.
For years, and he published most of the stuff that I did for a lot of the 70s and 80s. But now I've lost the train of my sentence.
Dennis Kitchen was your, you were talking.
Oh yeah, Dennis. Be sure to put exclamation points in the transcript. Oh yeah, exclamation. Dennis asked me. He said he was thinking of starting a new series of underground comics. Or actually, he didn't say it. He's thinking of doing a new underground comic, a comic to be called Gay Comics. I had come out to him in the interim between when I published my gay story and 1979. And so he knew I was gay. He asked if I would be interested in editing it. And I thought, it's a little scary because it would, be the final out of the closet thing. It wasn't quite the final one, that came a little later, but it would be pretty much out of the closet for all the world to see. And I thought, but this is a great way to come out, because it would not be a confession. It would not be about, oh, here's this deep, dark secret that now I'm telling you about. It was affirmative. We sent out a solicitation letter to Dennis's entire mailing list because we didn't know who was gay. So it was sent to everybody announcing we're going to do this book. We said, we don't know who's gay. If you're not gay, but you know a cartoonist who is gay, would you mind passing this letter on to them? And I said, I'm going to edit this book that Dennis is publishing called Gay Comics. And if you're gay, we would love for you to think about being a part of it. I know that you may have fears about the effect this might have on your career. I know what those fears are like, being gay myself. But I feel like now is a time, there was a lot of homophobia, public homophobia going on then. Harvey Milk had just been assassinated, etc. I said, it's very important for gay people to be visible. And I think this would be a real contribution to the gay movement if you would be a part of this. And so I got accomplished it. That took me out of the closet, and we discovered a lot of other gay cartoonists who were also afraid to be out, but who this was the moment when they thought, oh, they're doing this, I can do this. So we got more people ready to be in the book than we thought we would get. And it turned out that it was sold in gay bookstores and it was very popular among gay people, and so instead of being a one-shot, it became a series. I edited the first 4 issues. It came out about once a year, and but growing out of gay comics, which was read by a lot of my friends of sort of on the fringes of the counterculture, etc., but who also had footholds in the mainstream world. One of them being Richard Goldstein, and George Melko was their art director, who was also gay, and so Richard showed George underground gay comics, and Richard was writing an article about the anti-gay backlash that was going on, and he said, "Let's get Howard to do a page in the Village Voice about the anti-gay backlash." And so that was when that was going to be on newsstands all over New York, and I said, "Okay, this is it." People who've never seen an underground comic, may see this. And so I did that, and then the Advocate saw that, asked to reprint it, and a couple of fallen dominoes after that, they invited me to do a regular comic strip for the Advocate, which was going to be about this gay character named Wendell and his set of gay friends, and was running first frequently, and then it was very popular, so they made it an every issue thing for several years. Actually, I got the idea. It felt so good doing this full page in the Village Voice, all that room. And I would look at the Advocate, which was a tabloid at the time. It hadn't turned into a 8.5 by 11 magazine yet. So it was big pages. And I looked at those big pages and I thought, oh, that would be great for a gay comic strip. And in the 3rd issue of Gay Comics, I had done a story called Dirty Old Lovers, which was about an older gay couple and their randy ways. And it was an important acknowledgement that there's something other than hot young gay guys in the gay world. And but anyway, these characters were so much fun to bring alive that I proposed to the Advocate that I do Dirty Old Lovers comic strip. And they the editor liked the idea of a comic strip. They said, "Would you mind doing one that's about younger people?" So I created Wendell, and Wendell became central in my life for much of the 80s.
Let me ask you a question, because it sounds like, and tell me if I'm interpreting this correctly. For you professionally to come out as gay is still a big thing. It's that interesting place in all of our lives where, look, I'm still not out. Sometimes I think to myself, even though I've been on marches, I've gotten married in front of my father, my potentially first gay basher who changed his ways completely. I constantly find myself in a new place where I'm like, do I come out? And oh geez, there's that thing again, which is uncomfortable because coming out becomes a moving target, doesn't it? But in this case with you, so here you are, a lot of your life is out, and then you're about to make the jump into your career, or as my spouse may do one day, as the teacher. But it sounds like the way it happened was very kind of just matter of fact, as if, though it was a big thing for you, you just went ahead as if, I can't even explain it correctly, as if it was just like, and there's this thing that I do, and here it is. It's not a lot of fanfare. Internally, it sounds like a lot of fanfare, but externally, it sounds like, oh, here's this, gay comic activist, right? So it's as if your art allowed you to be that person to be out in a way that perhaps internally you didn't quite feel yourself to be yet. Am I making any sense here?
Well, here was what was a little different about my trajectory.
Go ahead.
I didn't want the fact that I did underground comics to keep me from having a mainstream cartooning career.
Mm-hmm.
So there was always this parallel thing going on. I would get, I was a freelance cartoonist, illustrator. I got some work in magazines when I moved to New York, back to New York in '77. Wasn't quite making it, but I finally got a job at Starlog magazine, which was a science fiction fan magazine, a newsstand science fiction fan magazine. And so I art directed there for a while, but then I was continuing to make connections and things till I finally felt like it was actually viable for me to be a full-time cartoonist. The gay things were my labors of love. The pay was small, nothing you could live on. But my bread and butter money came from doing magazine illustrations and things like that. So that worked out well. What, of course, I was afraid of when that Village Voice thing came out, because by then I had some regular clients, would they back off? Particularly one of them was a teenage magazine published by Scholastic Magazines called Bananas, sort of a cross between a teen fan magazine and Mad Magazine. Had various kinds, both kinds of articles. And so I was doing a regular comic strip for them and also illustrating articles that other people had written. And, people were very touchy about homosexuals and teenagers. But so I didn't wonder if it would affect it. But the fact is that, what I quickly learned was that most art directors in New York couldn't care less. They just wanted good pictures for their magazines. Now, people say, did your career suffer? I always say, well, thing is, I didn't experience it. It was sort of like when I came out in my personal life back in college. You don't know who is avoiding you. I don't know how many jobs I might have gotten if I hadn't been openly gay. But I don't feel their loss because I was still getting work. Mm-hmm. And during the 80s one time, I went to a lecture I was a member of a cartoonist organization called the Cartoonist Guild. And they had a little meeting and they had a lecture, this time by the editor-in-chief of a syndicate, the Universal Press Syndicate, which was notable for being the syndicate that published the most adventurous comic strips. Doonesbury was, their cornerstone comic when they started, and they quickly did others. They did The Far Side. They did For Better or For Worse. They did, a number of comics that were not just the kind of pablum that a lot of the syndicates were doing. So after this lecture, there was a milling around period, and I went to this editor and I said, "Do you think there could be a gay comic strip, a comic strip with a gay central character?" And he said, I don't think we could get away with that yet. I think you could have a gay character, but not the central character. What he was being was not homophobia, but realistic. Syndicates were at the mercy of advertisers and editors. And advertisers in particular are quick to be scared of controversy. And they were already taking chances with Doonesbury, which was political. But he felt that a gay strip would be a bridge too far. By then I basically had lost my interest in doing a daily comic strip. But I always felt like the one thing that could lure me back into that would be if I could do a gay newspaper comic strip. But that didn't happen until the late 90s when Jane's World, a lesbian comic strip, was put out. And even it was not successful in newspapers, but it was successful online. It was a big hit online. I did an introduction for her collection recently. And, so that's the way things were. The things teetered on the brink of being gay accepting, but not quite. You still had Jesse Helms in the Senate. You still had, horrible people saying homophobic things all the time in the moral majority. And then the AIDS epidemic, of course, gave lots of new reasons to demonize gay people. Mm-hmm. And so it took a long time for things to reach the point where it seemed like it would never happen. There was still sodomy laws, anti-sodomy laws, mm-hmm. that were affirmed by the Supreme Court in 1986. And it took 17 years for that to be overturned.
Scalia was unhappy with that.
Yeah.
This is going to give way to gay marriage.
Yes! Right. You got it, sister. It was so distressing, that 1986 decision, the Hardwick decision, mm-hmm. Because back in the 60s, in the gay bars, the civil rights movement was going on around us. The Supreme Court was the bastion of justice. It was the Supreme Court that, overruled, made it illegal to have to have racist laws, segregation laws. The Warren Court, time after time, affirmed the rights of black people. Mm-hmm. And it was so obviously to us that it was a justice issue with gay people. If we could ever get a case to the Supreme Court, they would be bound to be logical and not base everything on the Bible. And so it was a real blow to the gut when the Supreme Court said states could have anti-gay laws. I remember we had a big demonstration. It also was the year, of course, the centennial of the the bicentennial of the Declaration of Independence. It was a big demonstration at the Statue of Liberty, and gay people convened after the Hardwick decision in Greenwich Village, Sheridan Square, which is a sort of general gathering place, and we marched down to the Statue of Liberty thing, and we were really angry over that decision. Eddie was one of the civil disobedience people who was arrested in 1987 demonstrating against the Supreme Court in Washington at this 1987 March on Washington.
That was a goodie.
And so there was a lot of anger. But that gave fuel. Right now, I'm hoping the same thing happens with Democrats. I hope they're, angry enough to take the country back, take the Congress back in November. But anyway, there was that kind of strong political feeling going on.
And aside from marching, your gay comics, it sounds like, was a real, a very powerful feeling of being able to get something done, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, using this actually goes back to one of the first things you said. You thought that you could use art to help change the world. Mm-hmm. And now it seems to be coming to fruition for you in a very powerful way at this point. There's
a huge number of openly gay, openly queer, LGBT, all the variations, cartoonists, comics people now. And there's going to be a documentary about it next year that I was interviewed for. So, our little gay comics thing, it turned out, was like the sand in an oyster, By the end of we were just a relatively, maybe a dozen or so. I was kind of, as the editor of gay comics when it started, I was kind of the gatekeeper. basically I knew all of the out gay cartoonists, and by the end of the 90s, we had a show of gay comics people at the center in New York, and there were so many cartoonists that I didn't know about who were doing gay stuff because they were inspired by gay comics. And I got letters while I was doing Wendell from people saying that Wendell helped them come out because Wendell was about everyday gay people, and it showed a world where being open to gay was not a terrible thing. You could still have fun. You could still have friends, you know. And that was extremely gratifying to me.
You normalized it for people.
Yeah.
Powerful.
As did Alison Bechdel with Docs to Watch Out For.
Fun Home.
Mm-hmm.
Very good play. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you'd like me to ask you about?
Nothing comes to mind. I mean, obviously, a self-involved person like me could talk about himself forever, but it's always nice to have someone who gives you lots of attention.
Well, this is. I mean, this has been excellent. Also, I mean, it's just the trajectory, the complete backdrop of the 1960s with you moving through it from counterculture, the whole thing, and then where your activism comes alive with comics and that whole part of your coming out as well becomes it's a very interesting story. I completely understand why Robert wanted to make sure that you were part of this and that I would be paid for driving up here.
I'm glad that's true. When he mentioned it, as I think I said to you when I first communicated, I said I thought he wanted people who were at Stonewall and how it affected their lives. So the fact that I was only at Stonewall in a totally stoned, observing way, all of the impact on me happened gradually in the years that followed.
Over 90% of the stories are like that. There's a lesbian who I interviewed named Sandy Russo, who was part of the anti-war movement, civil rights movement, working with the Young Lords and the Black Panthers and so on, who kind of circumnavigates Stonewall other than to say, well, we all hated the cops, so we understood what was going on at that level, but too bad for them. And then, it doesn't come out until 1978. Rich story. 2 weeks ago, I interviewed Jonathan Lerner, who just came out with the book Swords in the Hands of Children about his days as a weatherman. And sort of the macho-ness of the weatherman, and maybe that even being his armor to be not gay, and how he circumnavigates that particular important movement. It does not become internalized, not articulated, while he is part of all of these other movements. The unfolding of these things is interesting. Stonewall becomes the iconic moment on a spectrum of gay consciousness and evolution, and we get to see where people sort of plot themselves along that spectrum with that in the middle of it. I'm speechifying, but so you didn't have to be part of the kick line at that moment. Though we have a wonderful interview with a guy named Martin Boyce who was part
Was he
of
one of the
kick line.
Stonewall girls?
Yeah, wonderful. Shall we wrap it up for now?
Sure.
Okay.